Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak about the First Step Act, and I want to say I think this is a very important bill. It's important legislation. I know a lot of people have worked very hard on it. There are only good intentions behind this legislation. I know that it's an intent to improve our criminal justice system generally, to reduce recidivism among offenders, to increase public safety. Those are the goals. I am sympathetic to all of those goals, and I'm seriously considering supporting this act. I want to see how this amendment process plays out, but I recognize a lot of good work has been done here. I do want to say, to begin, I'm also sympathetic with the legitimate concerns that have been raised about this legislation by law enforcement officers. I have spoken with people across Pennsylvania who protect us every day, who have some concerns about this. I've been glad to see that there have been changes made along the way, changes that have addressed some of the concerns serious concerns that I and others have raised. I do think there is still room for more improvement, and that's why I support the three modest amendments that Senators Cotton and Kennedy have proposed. One of the amendments will simply ensure that all violent felons, like carjackers and criminals who assault law enforcement officers and sex assault offenders, that they will not be eligible for the earned time credit. I thought that was part of the intent of this, so that's a good amendment in my view. A further feature is to notify victims of crimes before the prisoner who committed the crime is released. I think that's a reasonable provision for victims, and it gives them a chance to have their voice heard before the perpetrator is released. And finally, to simply require the Department of Justice to track the outcomes. Let's make sure we know. A few years from now, if this passes and signed into law, have we reduced the recidivism rate or not? We should have that information. So I think these are common sense amendments, and I support them and urge my colleagues to do likewise. But, Mr. President, my real purpose is to highlight one of the amendments that I have filed, and I hope I'm going to be able to get a vote on. My amendment concerns especially victims of crime, but specifically victims of child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, and other violent crimes, and the need to end Congress's longstanding injustice to these victims. Now, the First Step Act does a lot, especially for people who've committed crimes. But unfortunately, it doesn't do anything that I'm aware of for the victims of crimes, and these two things are not mutually exclusive. We have an opportunity here with this amendment to address something very substantive we can do for crime victims. Specifically, Congress should stop what I think is an unconscionable annual raid on the Crime Victims Fund. Since fiscal year 2000, Congress has diverted literally billions of dollars from the crime victims funds by using a budget gimmick to withhold money from victims and the organizations that help victims. Here's how it works. Every year, the Crime Victims Fund collects the money from federal criminal fines and penalties. There's no taxpayer money at all involved. These are criminal fines that result from convictions. The fund was created in 1984 with a very simple principle in mind, and that is that the money the federal government collects from those convicted of crime ought to be used to help those who are victimized by the crime. And under the federal statutes, the money collected in one year is supposed to be dispersed to victims of crime the next year. Unfortunately, starting in 1999, Congress began to systematically withhold some of the money that's supposed to go to the victims, effectively shortchanging the victims, people who through no fault of their own at all were victims of a crime. And you might ask, well, why would people do a thing like that? The reason it's done is because the federal government has bizarre and ridiculous budgetary rules, and one of them holds that when you shortchange victims of crime this way, when you refuse to allocate the criminal penalties to victims as you're supposed to, you get to pretend for budgetary purposes that you're saving taxpayer money. It's totally untrue. It's not factually saving taxpayer money at all. But you get to pretend that. And so in pretending that those savings have been achieved, it allows you to spend more money elsewhere. And there are a few things that Congress likes better than spending money. So this money, which is supposed to go to victims of crime, is instead spent on completely unrelated discretionary items in appropriation bills year after year. Now, how much, you might ask, does this matter? Does this actually add up to anything meaningful? Well, astoundingly, over the last 2 decades of this practice, Congress has used this gimmick to add $82 billion in unrelated federal spending that has all gone to increase our deficits and our debt. All because every year they withheld money that were supposed to go to victims of crime. Where did it go? Well, the money could go to anything that Congress decides to spend it on, anything in the Commerce, Justice, Science, or Probes bills. I'll give you one example. In 2014, Congress gave victims less than 6% of the money that they were supposed to give to victims of crime. Again, not taxpayer money, criminal penalty money. It used the remaining $11.8 billion for other spending. And that year, the CJS bill funded $360,000 for a NASA study that paid individuals $18,000 to lie in bed for 70 days, $1.75 million for a PBS documentary to promote a New York Times best-selling book, and $150,000 so that a game designer could develop a zombie-fighting web game. Just a few examples. This is beyond egregious, Mr. President. And because of this disgraceful behavior on the part of Congress, it's been much more difficult for victims of crime to receive the services they're supposed to get. These crime victims' funds, a lot of that goes directly to people who are helping some of the most vulnerable in our society. Now, because, in part, this money is not fully allocated as it should be, abused children sometimes have to wait weeks before they can receive the full medical and emotional services care that they need. There are rape victims who are not able to obtain the prophylactic medications they need to prevent them from contracting HIV/AIDS. Victims fleeing domestic violence, often unable to find a bed for themselves and their children, because Congress refuses to allocate the money it's supposed to allocate to these victims. So we can fix this, Mr. President. We can fix it. I think we could fix it this afternoon. Now, in fairness, in the past few years, the extent of this gimmickry, this terrible practice has diminished. And I give a lot of credit to Senator Shelby. The chairman of the Appropriations Committee has decided to increase the appropriations in recent years to something approximating where it should be. But still, there are billions that have not been allocated to victims. And there is no guarantee whatsoever that the next year, the year after, at any point in time, Congress could resume massively shortchanging the victims as it has in the past. So what I think we need is a permanent solution to this. My amendment will provide the fix that we need. It's identical to a bill that I've already introduced, which is called the Fairness for Crime Victims Act of 2018. This bill is endorsed by many, many victim advocacy groups. Last year, virtually identical legislation was unanimously passed out of the Budget Committee. Let me say that again, not a single Republican, not a single Democrat opposed my legislation in the Budget Committee. All it does is returns honesty to the Crime Victims Fund by ensuring a steady stream of funds, the very funds from criminals that are supposed to go to victims and their advocates. It would simply assure that they get what they're supposed to get. So, Mr. President, as the Senate considers the First Step Act, I think we should take this opportunity to end this unconscionable raid on the Crime Victims Fund. We're going to do something to help criminals. We should also do something to help victims. All I'm asking for is that we have a vote on this. If people disagree with me and they think we should continue this practice, okay, vote no. But let's have a vote. At a moment when we're doing so much for criminals, I think it's reasonable to do something for victims. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendment and call up amendment number 4120.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. This issue, when I spoke to Senator Toomey about it personally, struck a chord with me. I recognize that we've had this same debate in the Appropriations Committee. Its champion in the committee is Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma. who has at least for 2 years or maybe longer suggested the change which the senator from Pennsylvania brings to the floor. I think he made a compelling argument, and I voted with him for the change which he wished to see in the law. We did not prevail in the Appropriations Committee, at least didn't prevail in changing the budget rules, but Senator Lankford, with his effort in the committee, has prevailed in changing the allocation of funds. The amendment which Senator Toomey offers, Senator from Pennsylvania offers, it creates a new point of order against any CJS appropriation bill if it doesn't spend at least the 3-year average of collections in the Crime Victims Fund. There's good news. Because of Senator Lankford's effort and the support of Senator Shelby, which the senator from Pennsylvania noted, the amendment is not necessary. Since FY 15 through 18, the CJS appropriation bill has spent at least the 3-year average of collections, a total of $12.4 billion, which has been returned to crime victims. So we have, in fact, changed the policy, the budget policy, that governs how the Crime Victims Compensation Fund is distributed. What I would suggest, though, is that this good, worthy issue and battle, which I'd be happy to join on, does not belong on this bill. In fact, as a result, it could complicate this bill and its passage. We've been working to put this measure together for 6 years, Democrats and Republicans. There were some 82 or more senators, I know the senator of Pennsylvania was not one of them, who voted for cloture on this bill because we felt we should move forward in this debate. And I might say that some of the amendments the senator from Pennsylvania said he's going to support to this bill are not helpful. They are opposed by those who are behind the bill. So let's save this budget debate for another day. On behalf of myself and the ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Senate Appropriations Committee, I object.
Objection is heard.
Well, Mr. President,
Senator from Pennsylvania.
I'm not shocked, but I am extremely disappointed. You know, one of the things that's so disappointing and frustrating about serving in this body is it was once a body where a difference of opinion would be litigated on the Senate floor, including culminating in a vote. And we would decide, as a body, whether or not we wanted to proceed in a certain direction. But now, our friends in the minority are refusing to even allow the vote to occur. I'm not asking for a guaranteed outcome. I'm not asking for any outcome. I'm simply asking that we have a chance to debate and vote on whether or not victims of crime across America are going to get the allocation that they're supposed to get. In recent years, the situation has improved. And if that's the commitment of my friends on the other side, they should be willing to enshrine that improvement in law. But they're not, which might speak volumes about where this is headed. So, Mr. President, I am very disappointed that we're not going to get a vote on this amendment today. I do, however, hope that we'll be able to vote on and pass the Cotton and Kennedy amendments. And with that, I yield the floor.